This is the Internet Court of Truth and Lies, and its purpose is if you see something in the media that you think is the truth or you think is a lie, then you can take it to a group of other people to analyze it as a truth or a lie and see what they think about what you think. Invariably, what you find out is that everybody sees the same thing in different ways. In fact, the trial that we're doing today goes to the very heart of this. It goes to the nature of mathematics among humans, among all societies, the fundamental nature of mathematics. It tells the same story. This is an interesting trial. The way we control the discussion, it's called enforced moderated dialogue, is we have 8 standard verdicts. Those are never the right questions, but they're always the same questions. Their job is to keep the discussion on track. Let's cover the essential properties of lies and essential properties of truth without necessarily being the perfect discussion, the perfect questions that could be asked. The idea of this enforced moderated dialogue is to make sure that the discussion stays on track. Anybody can say, let's stick to your verdicts. This particular trial I call Warner's Fascism, which is a very strange title. I understand that. It says water is fascism and oil is the mathematics which keeps the brain machine from rusting. Mathematics has this incredible property of being able to discover truths that nobody really suspected are truths, doing it in a way that is essentially logically perfect. We're going to go through mathematics, and what this article really has to do with is another article written by this woman named Laurel W. I don't know her last name, who is a mathematics graduate student, or was one. She argues that fascism, like what we're seeing with Trump, what we see in Russia with Putin and so forth, authoritarianism has a negative impact on mathematics. People can't evolve the civilization using good math because mathematicians' work is suppressed. Let y'all see how mathematics works with respect to logic and how it proves things can be true and when it cannot prove things that can be true. The right place to start is on her paper. But before I do that, let's define the term mathematics before we start saying that fascism destroys it. I mentioned that if you look at the definition of mathematics in Wikipedia, you'll find there is no generally accepted definition of mathematics, period. But it turns out this particular lady, Lauren, identifies 2 types of mathematics, which is a beautiful distinction if you are like me, somebody who does math. Picture says stupid people are dangerous. She's arguing fascism or dictatorships force people to be stupid. If you're not stupid enough, then you'll be suppressed and basically done in. Basic understanding of mathematics from my point of view. Math starts off, you can do math by just simply giving an expression. So it's legal math to put down the number 5, and say, that's true. That's 5. 5 is 5. That's where you start. You start with saying, okay, I can see this is true. Math allows you to put an equal sign between two expressions which are true for different reasons, but one makes the other one true always. So the left side expression makes the right side true. The right side expression makes the left side true, period, as long as they come to the same value. Math is really good. It adds the notion of expressions that have to do with quantities of things, counting things. But there are certain forms of math where you're really not counting something, you're finding out what something is, for example. You're not necessarily counting it, or the counting is embedded in the thing, but the basic idea is always the same. When in school you learned how to take part of the left side and solve for one of the expressions in a mathematical equation. I'll give you an example. If I was looking at 5, and I said 5 is 5, so 5 equals 5. Great. Now, if I also accept that 2 plus 3 equals 5, I can put 2 plus 3 on the right side and say 5 is equal to 2 plus 3. And I can also move the things around. And I could say 5 minus 2 equals 3. The left side is true. The right side is true. Once you've established that once in a mathematical expression, you can then manipulate the entities to either side, and it will always be true. It's a way to reason about truth and know when truth has been violated. So math is just a way in which we've learned over the years how to reason explicitly about truth in a way that's actually more complicated than some of the ways that if we hadn't known math, we wouldn't know to do. If what you do is you say 5 is equal to 5, then somebody will say, no, it isn't. 5 trees are not equal to 5 atoms. That's true. So 5 is not equal to 5. But what I really did was I said 5x is equal to 5y, because it turns out I'm predicating that 5 with what the 5 is of on either side. In one case, it's of trees, and the other one is of atoms. 5 trees do not equal to 5 atoms. 5 trees equal to 5 gazillion atoms. Mathematics allows you to reason this way. It gives you ways to reason and discover how you can know what a value has to be for the equivalence to be true. That's really all mathematics is. That's fundamentally what it is. It's a way to reason very complicated things in very simple ways using the rules of mathematics. The guy who does mathematics, a scientist, for example, who's doing mathematics on things, he learns critical reasoning that way. He thinks in terms of what sort of causes what. And by the way, there's a formal mathematical understanding of causation that was developed by Simon and Rescher. I won't go into it, but we can also formalize causality, perceptual causality, so forth in mathematics with these equivalences, by the way. Having said that, you have to realize that if somebody says that you're not allowed to teach math, what you're doing is you're saying you're not allowed to teach critical thinking. If I say 5 is 5, you're not allowed to question that. If I say 5 x is equal to 5x, you're not allowed to question that. If you say 5x is equal to 5y, you're not allowed to question that. In other words, the idea is you're not allowed to do the logic that mathematics gives you. We have seen this in history. This article is about this being seen. What she does is interesting because she distinguishes what she calls intuitionism from formalism. This is a familiar concept that most people, I've never heard these terms used this way, but the intuition is what's called applied math or empiricism, where you're measuring something. So in physics, for example, or in most of sciences, it's intuition. Formalism is just pure math, where all you're concerned with is to not tie any of the math expressions to any physical reality, but be able to discover new ways that these equivalences can be maintained using advanced rule techniques and proofs that you can do over them and so forth and so on. For example, in formalism, you can develop set theory or integral calculus and stuff like that. Independent of empiricism, and independent of being a scientist, she points out correctly the intuitionists are the ones that are concerned with whether or not something is actually true of the world, of reality. Whereas in formalism, they don't care about reality. They care about whether or not you can prove that something is true, irrespective of whether or not it describes anything in reality at all. There are what I call pure mathematicians who do just formal math. That's a whole field in itself. It's a huge field. One of the things that she mentions in there is something called tensor calculus, which is the basis for general relativity. That came out of math and not out of physics, but it was Einstein that brought it into physics. That became general relativity. He turned some formal tricks in math, which, by the way, tensor calculus is just matrix algebra, to be clear. They use fancy names. And it's a subclass of matrix algebra, but it's just matrix algebra. The intuitionists, when you put an equation, one of the sides of an equation, to measurements that you can make in reality, then, like the number of trees versus the number of atoms, then you are turning formal math into an intuitive math, which she's calling intuitive, or I would call empirical or applied math. She's very correct about this. The axioms, the rules of math that are done in the formal space apply in the applied space most of the time. Most people don't realize this, but there are, in physics, for example, there are a lot of equations in physics where you can measure the quantities and so forth and so on. But you can also get things like a divide by zero, which is singularity, where the ability to physically measure an infinity is not there, it doesn't exist, and it's basically undefined, where the intuitive math just doesn't say anything. It's a gap. It's something that can't be known to be true. The applied math, that in the formal math is known to be something. Okay. Most people don't realize this, but in physics, they don't tell you about some of the equations you could derive from the thing, where you have to ignore part of the equation. One of the greatest papers on this is Einstein's original paper on relativity, where he basically, in order to figure out the speed of light stuff, he took an expression that would expand into a series of additions into essentially a polynomial. What he did was he said, I'm just going to throw out all the higher order terms. Einstein said that. He said, if I throw out all of the higher order terms and forget about them and say, I can't measure this, then you get equal MC squared. Crazy. The actual real expression, if you were to just be a pure formal guy, is vastly more complicated. But he threw it out and it turns out it works. So even though formal math is saying you can't do this, the physics math says you can, because I'm going to ignore these other things. Part of the truth that the math says is true, you just say is not true. And you're still doing good science. So that's a case of where you violate it. But this is a really good article. I recommend anybody who wants to understand why dictatorships and advancements in mathematics do not go together. It has to do with the fact that math is a way to use proven logic that's known to work, to discover new things about the world and to be able to build cars, make new materials, and discover things about the world and about people and so forth and so on. What an authoritarian government does is it says, no, you can't do this. I will tell you what's true. Everything is a 5 or a 6. Stop asking me any further. If you ask me any further, I'll put you in jail. That's the problem. This kind of stuff happened. And she gives numbers of examples of this happening back before World War II. That's the argument here. And what I have argued is that fascism rusts the brain's machinery. In other words, if you're not allowed to do math, then your ability to logically think things through, to critically think things through, and know that they're true or false goes away. If you teach math, people can prove things are true that they may not have otherwise been able to prove that are true to themselves. So they become much more capable of understanding what's true and what's false. And they reject this idea that somebody simply says, this is 5. Because they may say, this is 5, but when you try to add it up, you get 2 plus 2 equals 5. And you say, no, it ain't 5. This is what actually goes on. My argument is that this is true. I, of course, didn't mark that it was supposed to be true, but it does rust the brain's machinery. My verdict, this is true. The referenced article that I just mentioned makes a great case of this. The whole truth. Math is unique. So it does, particularly when it's doing quantitative things, it's like adding the ability to count things to regular logic. And so that's another view of math, is it allows you to add things. But what it's really doing is it's establishing a way to do equivalences of things that may seem not to be equivalent at first looking at them. And it also gives you a way to distinguish empirical truth from formal truth, which is really interesting, particularly if you ever get into it. Is the whole truth? Is it nothing but the truth? I said yes. I think I said yes. Yes, I said yes. What's the deceit? I said there is no deceit. Is the deceit intended? People are disagreeing with me left and right. The truth is intended, and everybody's agreeing with that, that I'm not lying, that I was trying to tell the truth. What's the motivation? The motivation was to be informative. I think that a lot of people are never really taught what math is from the point of view of how you regularly think about the world, how it applies in critical thinking. This is modern science. What's the social acceptability of the truth or lie? My argument is the logical demands of mathematics affects the logical demands that a person puts on his society and vice versa. In other words, everybody should be held to, if something can be understood mathematically, everybody should be held to it. Tensor calculus is actually pretty simple, but it's not obvious. The way people talk about it makes it very opaque. But what's actually done is pretty simple. Until you've actually done it, you don't realize how simple it is. But its purpose is for three-dimensional space to be able to create continuous curves in three-dimensional space with different curvatures, where the curvature comes directly out of the equation on the right-hand side, for example. The curvature at a point comes directly out of that equation. And a curvature is not a single value. The curvature will be a little vector of values. It'll have to be XYZ curvature. So what label would improve it? My argument is, it's true, it's interesting to read the details of the arguments on either side, which I found this article really interesting. So what I'd like to do is ask the jurors to give a 20 to 30-second overview of what they thought. I realized that at some level, I'm fortunate to have had one teacher who got me into math. He was a physics teacher. He explained things the way I'm explaining things, which made sense to me at the time. I've never had a problem with math after that. But there are very bad teachers out there, as we said last week. So juror one.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. I'm not sure. There's kind of 3 points I'd like to make. First of all, the way that mathematics actually aids and abets fascism. For example, the use of the equivalence sign, you have to already agreed or found an agreement before you can put the equivalence sign in. You've got to know that your sides of your equation are that, except the specific case of looking for an unknown, saying it's equivalent, but you still in some way in advance, you've already reached your agreements. And this is what it's a process that fascists does, is that they decide in advance what these things are and then tells you what the equivalence is, as it were.
And my argument is that if you're a mathematician, what you may well do is you may well say these are not equivalents, just like I did a few minutes ago when I said 5 is not 5.
Mm.
If it's 5 trees is equal to 5 atoms.
Exactly. So, but fascism understands this and makes use of it by being the one to make the definitions. And the second thing is about equivalences. Of course, when you're using operators, that equivalence only works one way. It's directional. So fascists can say, this equivalence works this way for us, for me, I'm defining it. And it doesn't, the argument against it doesn't work. There is no equivalence there if you're using kind of operators.
Yeah. So there are circumstances which what you just said is completely true. Yes. Okay. There's some other ones where it's not true.
We could talk about those.
Yeah, okay.
The other point I wanted to make is, of course, that human beings operate with lots of logical systems, not just mathematics. The debts and favors, trauma and stupidity and all these things, they're all logical equations in the human mind, not just mathematics. And they're not really open to mathematical analysis.
Yeah, so I've been arguing the whole time that the way we normally work is always intuitive truth. And because doing the logic, doing the math is hard. And you don't have time to do it on everything that you do.
Yeah.
You can't. Survival is doing things fast. So it is absolutely the case that the vast majority of the time while your brain is processing in predications, they're not processing in equivalence predications, absolute truth from truth. Okay.
Yeah, no, implications, that's right. But of course, fascism works quite well with those kinds of hidden, implicit things. And just the other point I want to say is, zero is the singularity. That's what I wanted to say about that.
Okay, that's another 5 hours.
Yeah.
I see the singularity always is something divided by zero. And if you think about the math, that's always If you ever get anything that can take something and divide it by zero, you're in trouble.
Yeah. I always think about zero as being the totality of negative and positive numbers. It's the whole set. Okay, it's zero. So you can have fun if you have an equation, 5
You're
over
adding.
0. You take the 5 out of the complete sum, and
Yeah,
you're actually left with a negative 5 at the bottom.
Yeah,
anyway.
So there's yeah. Okay, so we can anyway. Juror 2.
That's me, Bob. Yeah, my brain just short-circuited on that singularity comment. So I'm not a mathematician, but anyway,
Bet you are. I bet you are.
Well, now I
Bet you don't
understand why
even.
you named your case "Water is Fascism," but in equivalence, is fascism water?
Well, yeah, what I was saying was that oil and water don't get along together, and so water is fascism, and
fascism is not water. So
mathematics is oil, and they don't get together. They don't live together very well. One forms a bubble with respect to the other one. Yeah.
Look, if mathematics teaches some kind of logic, then fascism does not encourage why or how.
Yeah.
So that's my
well,
small.
And I think she said it right in her article. She said that it's the intuitive, empirical mathematics that suffers, because that's where the truth of reality is, in the empirical mathematics. The formal mathematics is just assumptions of truth. If you have these assumptions, then this is how you can, what these equations say. But they don't apply to anything. And we know that, for example, the case of Einstein and the equal MC squared thing, which derived from special relativity, he threw out the vast majority of the math just in one sentence.
I'm just surprised. Yeah.
All the higher orders I'm throwing away.
That kind of defies logic. Okay,
Right. But he turned out.
But it worked. Yeah, that's what I can't get my head around. That really can't.
It's crazy. Nobody can. You're not alone. That was Einstein's brilliant. He was just utterly brilliant to just throw it out right in your face. And now, by the way, it's done all the time. Now they throw these extended terms out all the time. But before Einstein, they really didn't throw them out. They believed them.
That's my feedback. Thanks.
Juror 3.
Bob, I have to say that you lost me at mathematics. I'm no good at mathematics at all, period. And I just went ahead and agreed with you on it because I'm nowhere near good at math.
I will say the same thing that I said to Muhammad. You'd be surprised.
I do good at getting 2 + 2 some days.
Everybody's that way. I do good at getting 2 + 2 right sometimes.
Yeah.
And a lot of times I don't. So you're not alone. So Juror 4.
Okay, hi everyone. I just want to say also, like Natasha, I'm not really good with maths. I don't like numbers. And at some point, I thought maybe my brain is also rusting with the water. But then I had to question and just try and make a bit of research about the topic. And then I was like, no, maybe the oil is still working. So my thoughts about the case is that the accusation that fascism rusts the brain's machinery is partly, okay, I won't say partly true, but it's largely true if we're going to understand it as a metaphor for systems that restrict the freedom of thought and punish curiosity and critical or logical thinking. As history would give us clear examples, such as with South Africa, the apartheid era, where Bantu education systems were in place, which deliberately were designed to limit critical thinking and keep the oppressed in positions of labor rather than leadership or innovation or just thinking out of the box. When education is used as a tool to control rather than to liberate, people are trained to obey rather than to question. And intellectual growth begins to decay in a sense, which you can say it does rust. So it's not really a lack of intelligence, but it's a lack of freedom, if you can put it in that way. But at some point, I do want to say that mathematics alone can not fix this problem. It's for me, I feel like it just oversimplifies it, unless the maths is used in a symbolical form. And, what kills the rusted mind is not just numbers, but it's logic, reasoning, and the freedom to question, which is what maths represents. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say. But I also want to add this part about, I think it's a fact about South Africa today. You would see that there's a declining interest in STEM fields, and especially with students that are funded by NSFAS. NSFAS is a bursary scheme for I think it's the government bursary scheme that it gives to South African students. Those students choose degrees that promise quicker employment because failure is too expensive and the curiosity is a luxury, which is what maths and your sciences would probably present. And so their choices are not driven by the inability, but they are driven by survival. And so I think people need to reach self-actualization, and which is a level where creativity, invention, and deep thinking occurs. But if they're still struggling for your basic needs like food safety and stability, therefore, I don't know. That's just my take for over the points
I
of the
think
thing.
you're really right. So this is a really interesting. The one of the things that I think is true, because I've known a lot of mathematicians and scientists and so forth, is these what she was calling formal mathematics. That's the mathematics that doesn't care about reality. It really doesn't. And what I've noticed over the years is the people who do the formal mathematics, it's a relatively small number of people. They tend to be very intelligent, but they are very non-social. They don't want to rock any boats. They know that if they started applying mathematics, that's where you start rocking boats. Some of my friends who are just pure formal mathematicians are some of the quietest, most pleasant people you'd ever want to meet, but they also can't explain what they're doing, which is they make terrible teachers, which is what we were saying last week. It's interesting that the formal ones are actually trying to escape reality, because if they were bringing their math to reality, they would be getting people mad at them. They don't want people to get mad at them. In her article, Lauren's article, she was saying that, which I thought was an interesting twist on this. What you just said makes a lot of sense to me. So Juror 5. Juror 5 here.
I don't know much about this, but the little I could find about this topic is that fascism kills flexible thinking and math trains the brain to reason clearly. That part checks out, but it oversells math as some kind of cue. Fascism is not just bad logic, it is fear, identity, power, and emotion. You don't undo that with equation alone. Math can sharpen the mind, sure, but resisting fascism also needs ethics, history, and courage. This idea is clear, but it simplifies every human problem into a technical one. Thank you.
I think Lauren was saying at the end of her article, was pointing out what happened to the mathematicians in the Nazi in World War II. They did things like committed suicide or quit, or they couldn't do what they knew how to do, and so they quit, which is, I think, very similar to what you were saying. Math is a very special way to do logic. It takes a lot of effort to do it right, but that's all it is. And people are intuition engines. We can do logic, and we will do it when it's easy. And when it's hard, we won't do it unless we have a means to do it. If the government is suppressing that, then the government's suppressing that and we won't do it. So a threat to my life will cause me to stop doing math, or at least stop telling you I'm doing my opinions. Juror 6.
Evening, everyone. Just like everyone, mathematics is not my cup of tea. There's a reason why I chose to do anthropology than going into STEM thingies. But from an anthropological perspective, the claim that fascism rusts the brain captures an important truth, but it frames it very narrowly. Physicists, remember, systems do not simply weaken individual reasoning. They reshape the entire social environment. So in anthropology, we see how that authoritarian ideologies operate through such things as ritual, symbolism, moral narratives, and the control of collective memory. Just like how Juror 4, I think, said that during apartheid, our education system was actually designed to make our people on how to behave, on how to think, on how to go on with their life. So this system, it reduces the cognitive diversity by enforcing conformity, suppressing the decent, and privileging obedience over critical reflection, just like how she said again before. So in this essence, fascism does constrain the conditions under which complex thought can flourish. But however, the idea that mathematics can fix this damage oversimplifies how human belief or system functions. While mathematically training strengthens abstractions, logic, and problem-solving ideology, it's not sustained by a faulty reasoning alone. Fascism persists because it taps into fear, identity, historical grievance, and emotional belonging, and dominance that mathematics does not directly address. In anthropological researches on propaganda and political socialization, it shows that people often accept authoritarian narratives even when they contradict logical evidence. Therefore, while mathematics can contribute to intellectual discipline, it cannot itself counter the social, cultural, or emotional mechanism that sustain the physicist's thought. Combating the fascism requires a broader intervention, historical consciousness, or ethical education, media literacy, and so on, that encourages pluralism. So the accusation that is intellectually prerogative and partially valid, but it risks reducing a deeply social phenomenon to a technical problem, which limits the explanatory power. So yeah, that's my take on the case.
Yeah, so this is a very special, this particular argument is a very special argument. It has to do with the impact of fascism on mathematicians, right? That's what it really has to do with. But the point of math is really teaching new forms of critical thinking that most people don't use most of the time. But every once in a while, you wind up using some math that you learned. But most of the time, you don't. It just doesn't, it's not part of, you just don't have a need for it. As opposed to being an anthropologist, if you're an architect, you will use math all the time because you want to make sure that building or the bridge stands. And without doing the math, you won't be able to do it. The bridge you build will fall. So depending upon your area that you live in, there are some areas where math becomes a very serious part of the way you think a lot of the day. And it's just another thing. Juror 7?
Hi. So I'll start off simple by saying, when I started doing research on this case, all I really knew of fascism was with relation to the Nazis. I think you mentioned it as well. But either way, what Lawrence started this case in a discussion with a friend used to believe only science and that equals truth. And then at the end, she describes on now he's a critical of that belief, such as closed and hard to question system of truth could be attracted to fascism. And really then I think with my second answer I think my second question, and then I said is what is it the whole truth? I said initially yes. So I would like to change it and so really say now no whilst reading the other jurors' accusations. I would then say that fascism doesn't rust the brain, it also reshapes the emotion and identity and fear and belonging. People don't fall into fascism only because they stop thinking clearly. They often pulled into insecurity, anger, and pride, and social pressure, whilst math strengthens resourcing part alone doesn't dismantle the ideology. That also runs on myth and logical thinking upon and then power. So that's how math shapes it. And then at its heart, I would say that just to wrap my summary up, at its heart, math works because people are free to ask questions and argue and chase ideas. And that doesn't really fit well with authority and control. Fascism movement tried to bend that, and I think Lauren uses
I think that's this woman's major point. What you just said is, I think if there was a theme for her paper, the one that I pointed
yeah.
to, that's her
Mhm.
theme. That's
Yeah.
exactly what you said. It just nails what her main theme is. It suppresses open discussion. And mathematics, particularly applied mathematics, gets deeply into open discussion. And the mathematicians, the formal mathematicians, they'll get into open discussions about things that only they understand. Okay. But because their reality is just the math itself, not how it applies to reality. And it's interesting, but anyway, your point is yes.
Hello everyone. I don't know much about this case, but I did some research and what I follow up is on Fascism disrupts critical thinking while mathematics offer a tool to counteract. This is a perspective focused on using objective and logical. And what Fascism does, it thrives on subversion of reality through propaganda and emotions. In the way how people view mathematics is like an objective universal language used on logic and evidence. The conflict with Fascism is mathematics and scientific progress without truly thrive under the boot of Fascism, which weakens education and destroys scientific progress. So, like mathematics and scientific, it's like water and oil. It doesn't go together. Thank you.
The guy who discovered the speed of light and electromagnetics and all the equations for that and so forth and so on was Maxwell. Maxwell said that all mathematics is an analogy. It is not an explanation. So what it does is it establishes some analogies that are true of the world. This is the applied math, but it explains nothing. It just establishes how you can do a true analogy in the sense that you can prove that this measurement will equal that measurement and so forth and so on. And that's what it does. But it is not anything more than an analogy. It is not an explanation. And I think that's true of mathematics in general. I believe that Maxwell wrote that book when he was like 18 years old, but it was published in 1861, where he said, here I'm doing all this math. And he said, I don't regard it as an explanation of anything. I regard it as an analogy. It's just stating some analogies that are mathematical analogies, and they seem to tell you what truths to expect, and they seem to come out as correct when you measure things. But he said to believe that they are actually explanations of how physical reality is actually working is incorrect. And I actually am a strong believer in that math is not an explanation. Now, there are a lot of people who think that it is, but I don't think that it is. Yeah, it's just me. So this sounds really good. We're at the hour, and I should go ahead. I counted the number of Medium articles that I've done so far, and it's 60 of my articles. And I counted the total number I have. It's over 200.
Wow.
So we have several trials.
Sounds good.
Before we, the next ones I'm doing are not so weird as this one. This one is truly weird, but it's just an interesting thing that this person, by the way, she's looking for a job. I don't know if y'all read her whole paper, But at the end of her paper, she says, my favorite message to send to organizations I believe in, I'm a mathematician and data scientist. Are there any tasks I'm in a unique position to help with? As an educator, we have a responsibility. Whatever skill set, we have to use it to resist. So she's looking for a job. So this was an interesting, another way to put this is, this was an interesting application for a job.
Maybe we should hire her at Truth Court, Bob.
I'm gonna try. I don't